Welcome back to a special Halloween episode of Concrete Play. I'm making it a Halloween episode because I can't stop the police sirens. Let's go ahead and talk about stats. Stats are in every game and they're an incredibly important part of every game design, but very few people actually talk about them. Very few developers think about stats as a thing on their own. Normally they just kind of throw together whatever stats feel good. So I thought I would teach you my approach to stats. Now, this might be contentious because it's a fairly specific approach, so if you have an alternative opinion or a counter-argument, feel free to put it down there below. So I think stats exist for only one reason: to allow the player to compare things. Yep, that's the only reason. How could that be? Well, let's talk about a game where you play a little elfie boy and you run around with a sword and you fight monsters, and of course we're talking about Legend of Zelda. Any of them will do, and you got like a, there, now you're Legend of Zelda, and there's your monster. Now, Legend of Zelda does have quite a few stats, but they're hidden behind, under the scenes, and you don't normally get to see them as a player. The only stat you really see is hearts. Your health. The enemy has some as well, but when the player wants to compare himself to the enemy, the player doesn't try and compare his hearts to the enemy's hearts. Instead, the player is comparing his hearts to the enemy's attack power, which is another stat. Those are supposed to be swords, but they're all just like fences. So, how can the player see the attack power of the enemy? By getting hit, usually. It's not normally displayed on screen real clearly until you get hit, but once you get hit by an enemy, you know how much damage they do. Of course, the player also has an attack power that goes up over time as they find new swords. So if you get hit by an enemy and it does 3 health, 3 hearts of damage, and you've only got 4 hearts, you're going to be like, okay, that enemy hits really hard. I have to be very careful. Maybe I should run away. Maybe I should use a bow. Maybe I should use a special attack. I should try and do something to keep myself from dying. On the other hand, if that enemy only takes 1 hit for you to kill, you'll be like, okay, he hits hard, so I have to make sure I just get in the first attack. On the other hand, if your attack is low and it would take 8 hits to kill him, you're like, okay, this is really dangerous. I might want to like run away and save my game and maybe level up, get some more upgrades before I try this again. So just with these 2 stats, you already have some semblance of an understanding about what sort of tactics you're going to have to take in order to get through this particular challenge. And the same is true of zombies. If you're being attacked by 4 zombies, each one individually has low stats, but all combined, you might have to think long and hard about a tactic that can take them all on. Of course, those aren't the only stats. There are a lot of stats. In addition to really obvious stats like how much damage the shield prevents, and how fast you move, and how fast the enemy moves, and how much damage they prevent, rather than just those, there's also things like you have 3 or 4 different attacks, and each one has different stats, at different speed, different range, different damage, different amount of time it takes to boot up, and different amount of recovery time. And because of that, you have to wonder, what's the point of all of that? What are the points of having 3 different attacks? Well, you're generally not comparing the attack to an enemy stat. Instead, you're comparing the attacks to each other, and you're trying to figure out which attack would serve best in any given situation. So these 4 zombies, you don't want to use your basic slash on them because then one of them will get hit, but the other 3 will grab you. So instead, you decide you're going to use your fast thrust slash, your dash thrust, or maybe you'll jump and do a down attack and bounce on their heads with your down swords, or maybe you'll do a spin attack and knock them all back. There's a lot of approaches, and which approach that you take depends on A, what the enemy situation is, and B, whether or not your attacks, whether or not, out of all your attacks, which one has the best stats for the situation. So these stats are all hidden away behind the scenes. The player doesn't get to see them. Instead, the player experiences them, and it's quite a tangle. It's a combination of things like how fast can you and the enemy run versus roll versus block, how large are they, how long is their range, how fast can they attack. There's a lot of these stats, and they all kind of blur together. And so when you're doing this kind of action game, you normally don't pull out a spreadsheet. You're not like, well, according to my calculations, the wolf is 1 meter per second too fast. Normally, you just play it a bunch and you're like, okay, the wolf feels too fast. Let's take the wolf down a notch. But there are games where your stats are used in a much more crisp and clear manner. So in these games, you play a little elfie kid, and you've got yourself a sword, and you got hair and buckles and belts and zippers, and then there's got another guy over here who's got a big gun, and then you've got someone with another big sword, but it's a Japanese-style sword, and then you've got someone with a staff. And of course, we're talking about Final Fantasy. So Final Fantasy games have a lot of stats. They have hundreds and hundreds of stats. And that's not exaggerating. If we look at the situation, every party member has health, mana, level, experience, power, defense, dodge, hit, magic power, magic defense, magic dodge, magic hit, and maybe a couple more. And then, of course, you've got a lot of slots for equipment. And every slot for equipment, the equipment has its own stats. And then you got 4 party members, and you got like 10 background members that you can pull in at any time. It's a lot of freaking stats. But this is a degenerate design. Almost none of these stats matter. How much don't they matter? Well, in Final Fantasy VI, a very well-regarded game, 3 of the stats aren't implemented at all. So it's a kind of degenerate approach, but what was their intent? What are they doing with these stats? Why do these stats exist? Well, the secret is here. In these sorts of games, it's often about trying to create the best party you can. So rather than trying to compare the speed or magic defense of a fighter to an enemy's speed or magic defense, you're comparing them to the other members of the party. And that allows you to formulate a battle plan so that you can shunt all of the enemy's power against places where you're strong. So you're building a party where you've got your fighters in the front row, because when the enemies attack, those fighters can take the damage the best. Exactly how high their defense is doesn't matter. It just matters that they have the best defense in your party. And the magician is in the back. Maybe you equip someone with a bow because they're not strong enough for the front rank, but they're not very good at magic. And the magician, you have to think, well, he has a limited amount of magic to cast. Do I want him to cast a magic in this fight or not? So you got all of these considerations, and it's because all the stats are really kind of mixing together and mingling up. Now, in these games, you do have the same kind of situations as in a Zelda game where your party is facing an enemy, and you have to know how strong the enemy is and whether or not you need to take a specific battle tactic against that enemy. But rather than be about stats, it's usually about level. So, this will be a level 98 enemy, and you'll have a level 70, level 68, level 72, level 84, and you'll be like, okay, we're a little bit under level, this guy might be rough, I should really bring out the guns. And you'll also sort of get a feel for how strong the enemy is if you clash and he hits you a couple of times. You'll start to get an impression of how much trouble you're in when you face these guys, and you can come up with, in your head, a relative power level. So you're not really relying on the stats to compare yourself to the enemy very much, aside from maybe level as a very, very basic indicator. Instead, all of the stats are built specifically so you can compare your characters to each other. Now, I'm not even saying that the stats are built so you can compare armor or anything like that, because if you go into a shop in a Final Fantasy game and you have 3 armors, well, those 3 armors are going to be just specific for each class. So you're going to have the mage armor, and you're going to have the thief armor, and you're going to have the armor for the warriors, and you're not even going to be able to buy them if you're the wrong class. So there's really no choice in which armor is better. You're not comparing the stats of the armor, except in the most vague way possible. You just know that this is a better armor, and you're computing whether or not it's better with your current cash level and your current equipment level and your current characters in your party. So you'd be like, okay, well, which of these should I buy and for which characters? And to do that, I need to compare which characters are strong compared to which characters and what role they play in this battle algorithm I've set up. Great. Now, there are times when you can buy multiple armor for the same character, but it's not going to be competing armor, it's going to be cooperating armor. So you'll get like chest plate and a helmet and boots, and then your choice will just be how much money you want to spend on upgrading your character, and whether or not that fits into your budget. Speaking of which, the budget is a stat, and it's very similar to hearts. So if you have $1,000 that you can spend, that's sort of like having 1,000 hearts in Zelda. So you might say, okay, well, this armor costs $600. That's very similar to knowing that an enemy does 4 hearts of damage when you've only got 10 hearts, or 6 hearts or whatever. So you can get a feel for how much effort is required to buy each piece of gear, and you can start to make your decision as to how to get through the situation as best you can. And that might be to back off and grind for some more time. It might be to buy armor for your most important character. Maybe you buy weapons rather than armor. Maybe you buy one spell, one armor, and one weapon. It's up to you, and it is all about your current cash level and how much your characters relate to each other. Who needs it most? Who's in what roles? So, how do you design something like this? How do you design a system so that you can get the best performance out of comparing your characters? I want to be able to compare things to each other. How do I make it happen? Well, let's back off and talk about a completely different kind of RPG. We're still talking about RPGs here because they are the stat monsters. They do stats. But let's back off and talk about Skyrim, or really any of the Elder Scrolls games. You're playing one character, so you're not comparing your character to the other people in your party. Instead, what you're doing is you're comparing your character to fictional versions of your character that have different stats. And so, you might make a character that is a magician, or a thief, or a fighter, or a magician, thief, fighter, and the game allows you to do that to some extent. And it allows you to build the character that you want to build in the way you want to build them. And how does it do that? Well, fundamentally, it's about stats. At its heart, this approach uses what I would call stat blending. So even though you might think, okay, well, there are 3 basic classes. You've got warrior, you got mage, and you got rogue, right? The basic 3 classes. And in some games, you might actually choose one of these classes. But in an Elder Scrolls games, you don't choose a class. There are still those 3 basic approaches, but you sort of kind of angle at them rather than choosing them outright. And how is that supported? Well, you have stats. Let's say you've got 6 stats. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 6 stats. And the idea here is that 3 of these stats would be for warrior. And 3 of these stats might be for mage. But what stats are for rogue? Well, 3 of the stats are for rogue. So the idea here is that you have stats that overlap in use. And that means that if you're a real great rogue, you are a moderately decent mage warrior. And that's usually reflected in most of these Oblivion games, because that's how Elder Scrolls games, because that's how they're designed. You might have some magic to help you do your roguery, and you're using your bows, but you can also fight with a sword if things get rough, and you can, do this and that. Whereas if you're a warrior, you're kind of a dedicated warrior, but you can do just a little bit of roguery, like you got a bow maybe. Or if you're a dedicated mage, you're a mage all the way, but maybe you sneak a little bit, You don't have to always fire off your fireballs all the time. So by having these stats correlate to different tactical patterns in the game world, you can allow the player to choose which tactical patterns they want to focus on and which tactical patterns are adjacent to that and kind of drawn in partially. Of course, there's a lot more than just those 6 stats. These games are very complicated and very poorly balanced, but the poor balance doesn't really act against them a lot of the time. Most people who hate Skyrim hate it because of the writing, and we might talk about that some other time, but they don't hate it because of the stats, except unless they're comparing it to Oblivion, which had a much more hardcore stat engine. But either way, you still have other things. You've got skills as well as stats and all sorts of other stuff, and how they all intertwine is very complicated. And how do you do it? Well, actually, I even made an error, because even though I wrote Skyrim, I was talking about Oblivion here. Skyrim doesn't even have this kind of stats. They've just got health, endurance, and mana, and then everything else is a skill. But those skills are still stats. Yeah, so it gets a little bit complicated. It all weaves together. And how do you control that weave? Well, this is how you control the weave. You have specific things that you want your player to be able to do, or tactics that you want them to be able to employ. You want them to think about your world in specific ways. And the way you do that is you create stats which kind of cluster together all of the things that need to be clustered together while separating out all the things that need to be separated out. And that is, you do that by allowing those stats to compare on those axes. So, for example, if you have a situation where you want to know whether or not your character should use a sword, a fencing saber, or whether or not your character should use a giant axe, well, we can look at their strength stat, right? And then we would also compare that with their maybe agility stat. Now, it's not that strength is a fighter stat and agility is a rogue stat. It's that the strength stat gives a better bang for the buck when you equip a heavy weapon, and the agility stat gives better bang for the buck when you equip a light weapon. So you might simply say, well, is my strength higher than my agility, or vice versa? And that should determine the kind of weapon I'll do the best with. But these stats aren't competing. They're being compared to show the player, which direction they might want to take things. But it's not like a higher strength is better than a higher agility. You ideally want both. As the designer, you thought in your head, well, I want to have some characters that fight using agility-based weapons, and I want to have some characters that fight using heavy weapons. I need to come up with a good way to distinguish the two and make it so that you have a reason to choose one or the other, rather than saying, okay, this guy is a heavy weapons expert and can only equip heavy weapons. This guy is a light weapons expert and can only equip light weapons. That means that your balancing is bad. If you have said that the heavy weapons guy can only equip heavy weapons, then you are admitting that your light weapons might be better in his hands. And vice versa. If your light weapons experts can only equip light weapons, you are admitting that your heavy weapons would be better than their light weapons. So you want to balance it by thinking about the stats. Rather than by gating everything into these arbitrary gateways, it's much better if you have a much more delicate balance and you allow the player to develop their own preferences and guide the growth of those stats in the ways they prefer. You can see this super clearly in any game which is tactical, like if you're playing a Final Fantasy Tactics game and you've got a party of like 18 people, you build that party out of people that you know are going to be good at specific roles in the game. So you have your you have your mage and your fighter and that sort of stuff, and you construct this party dynamic out of that. You get a feel for how your fights are going to progress. You're not comparing your red mage to their red mage. You're comparing your red mage to your fighter, and you're kind of blocking out, well, these guys need to be in front, these guys can be second rank just in case, because if they are hit, it's okay, they can survive a little bit. These guys need to be way in the back because they are vulnerable. And you build your own tactics out of that by using those stats. And once again, what are those stats? Well, a big thing would be how much damage resistance they have, whether that's in the term of health or armor or whatever else. Your warriors are going to be able to take more hits, and so they get put on the front. But what happens if your warriors get hit by magic? Is magic resistance a different stat? Now we're talking a little bit about actually designing your game. Do you want magic resistance to be a separate stat from armor? Instinctively, the current thinking is probably yes. Most people instinctively say our magic and our armor should be different because that way you can have magic resist. You have your mages take the front line and be magic resistant against magic users or whatever. But in truth, normally what we think of is health. And if we're talking about a fighter, armor is great, but normally what happens is that the health and the armor both go up, and they both go way, way up, and they kind of get along, and then the low magic resistance just means that you lose health a little bit faster. It doesn't make your health worse than a mage's. Even a mage with a high magic resistance is going to have a worse health and still die off too fast. So you can think about how it's going to work out, but you have to think ahead. You can't just throw magic resistance in there and say, okay, I want magic resistance as a stat. No, stop. You need to start to think about what sort of situations you want to have arise. You want the player to always be thinking, how do I get through this in the best way I can? So you should think up these situations for your game design. For example, I've done that example where you kill a monster and you absorb a monster, and then you can transform into a monster, right? Well, what sort of stats should I have for my monster characters? What sort of battle situations do I want to arise? Well, I kind of like the idea that there's a big size difference between monsters. I kind of like the idea that maybe if you transform into a big monster, you're going to have to fight a lot of little monsters. Or maybe you transform into little monsters and you got to fight a big monster or medium-sized monster. So the size of the monster starts to matter. That's not a stat that normally comes up in an RPG. You don't generally have size as an important stat. But in this situation, I have a combat scenario in my head where I can see a giant monster, trying to bite at smaller monsters, and I can think to myself, size clearly has to be a stat, or a stat-like attribute. I need to have size really matter. And then I can start to think, well, what if the big monster is slow? It would be a huge priority for the big monster to get fast to take on other small monsters, but what if it's a big monster versus a big monster? Sure, speed is still an asset, but now that the monsters are on the same size, it might be better for a slow monster so you can focus on improving your damage. So I can have like a big monster that's good against small monsters, or I can have a big monster that's good against big monsters, based solely on the existence of this speed stat and how much I've focused on it. So I better have a speed stat as well as a size stat. Of course, small creatures' high speed means that they can take on larger, slower enemies, but a low speed isn't necessarily bad because I can focus on something else, like magic or something like that. The small creatures don't have to have a high speed. There are other sorts of tactical situations that can arise when a small creature has a low speed. So because of this, you can really start to think out the stats that you're going to need. And of course, you can change them later, but the idea is you don't just want to go with the bog standard 15 stats that Final Fantasy uses and just kind of hope for the best. Your stats are a critical part of how you tell the player about how your game works. Your stats allow the player to compare one thing to another thing and figure out where they stand in the game world. Whether your stats are cash or health or how many pieces of armor you can wear or what your size is, the idea is the player will look at that stat and they will feel that stat if they can't see it, and it will allow them to figure out where they stand in the world, where they stand relative to their other party members, where they stand relative to an enemy. That's my thought on stats. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to either expand or disagree or talk or whatever down below. I'll try and comment when I get comments. Thank you very much.